Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on changes to audit practice. My name is Emma Marks and I am the Manager of Education and Guidance in ASQA, and today I'm coming to you from the lovely and warm Brisbane. I am joined today with Carmen Basilicata, who is ASQA's Project Lead for Quality Assessment and Compliance. She is unfortunately in not so warm Melbourne, but it is still an absolutely beautiful place. Now, before we begin, I do actually want to acknowledge that normally during the webinar, you can see our faces. Unfortunately, due to a software update, we're having a bit of problems and camera is not available for either Carmen or I. So we will try to make the presentation as engaging as possible just through speaking. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware that over the last 12 months, ASQA has been undergoing a reform as we position ourselves as an effective modern regulator to deliver on future directions of the wider VET reform roadmap. There are a lot of parts to this reform, but we wanted to talk to you today about one being the changes to our audit practice. Before we do start the session though, I will go through the basics about how these webinars work. In terms of audio, you would have joined the session using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to use your phone to listen to the webinar, select telephone in the audio panel of your control panel, and the dial-in information will be displayed. For this webinar, all participants have their audio muted, so you should only hear either Carmen or I talking. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes. We are aiming to present for about half of that so that there is plenty of time at the end for questions. You can submit text questions to us by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. From experience, going through these past webinars, we actually get quite a lot of questions. So based on that, what we try to do is instead of responding to individual questions, we'll group them as themes so that we can talk about everything that surrounds it and try and give as much information as we can. If we can't get to all questions, however, what we do is consider any question posed. It might result in updated FAQs to guide future webinars or for other education resources that are on our website. I will say though, please keep questions broad and relevant to the entire audience as we're unable to answer questions specific to individual situations. And finally, this presentation is being recorded. So in the coming days, we will upload this to the ASQA website and you will receive a link as well. Next slide, please. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So it is an understatement for me to say that this year has been big. For many, it has been hard, and also for many, there have been a lot of reviews, reflections, readjustments, realignments, and reinventions. For ASQA, our reform started in 2019, so many months before COVID. Towards the end of last year, you would have started to see changes resulting to what we were talking about, how we were talking about things, and what we were working on. And then COVID happened, and like you, we had to make some changes, particularly around the guidance we have provided to support you. But we're still working on our reform activities. So today I will talk very briefly about the rapid review to give you some context, and then I'll hand over to Carmen. And that I expect is the most interesting part for everybody. Next slide, please. So as said, the ASQA reform started just under 12 months ago. As part of that, a review was undertaken to look at our internal practices and processes and to recommend any adjustments, to look at our governance model and to consider the wider VET quality framework to drive overarching improvements. This work was conducted by an external agency and was completed with a report that was released on the 30th of April 2020. Now you can read a copy of that report, and I have included in red on this slide the website link so you can go to it and download and review it. The rapid report included 24 recommendations, and all of these have now been accepted by government, and this sets out a long-term vision to evolve ASQA as a more modern and responsive regulator. Our overarching goal is to move from input and compliance controls to a focus on self-assurance and excellence in training outcomes. Next slide, please. As this is a long-term vision, the work we're doing is being delivered in a staged approach, and we're keeping you informed and engaged as we go through it. On our website, which is asqa.gov.au, and from that homepage, there is a link where you can get to the reform initiatives. There is a lot of information on the work that we're undertaking, and if you also subscribe to the ASQA updates, which is our monthly email that goes out, we also provide updates there as well. Some of the things that we have delivered and continue to work on this year are a significant focus on engagement and supporting the sector through education and guidance. So this has included launching a new website, releasing several podcasts to assist providers to understand audits and assessment, conducting a series of webinars which have focused on supporting providers during COVID, including about distance or online delivery, releasing a COVID-19 risk monitoring strategy, which has allowed us to identify and communicate to the sector 3 key risk areas that have arisen from providers changing their delivery in response to COVID-19. And also establishing a new stakeholder liaison group, which has allowed us to create a stronger connection with the sector and respond to operational issues on an ongoing basis. So there's information about that on our website as well, but it's quite an interesting group. We've been able to access people who are both private providers, public providers, community providers, schools, going through employers, etc. So we're making sure that we're actually accessing a wide range of people and also consultants as well. We have been building on a common understanding of self-assurance. This includes consultation with the sector to gather ideas on our intended approach to increasing our focus on self-assurance and examples of existing good practice in the sector. And again, there's also a webinar on our website to know more about where we're heading with that. We have made internal governance changes to support us to implement the reforms. This includes the first stage of an organisational restructure, which came into effect on the 1st of July and also saw the creation of a number of new SES positions and a new engagement and education group to progress our enhanced educative approach, and changes to our audit practice, which are definitely the big one for the moment. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Carmen and she can go through these significant changes.
Great, thanks very much for that introduction, Emma. Before I take you through the core content of today's webinar, I just want to acknowledge that many of you are probably keen to find out more about how to prepare for an audit, the audit process, and what you can expect. And while these are really important questions, they're not the topics intended to be covered today. But I would encourage you to access information that's available on ASQA's website about what happens during an audit and how to prepare. There are also frequently asked questions about audits available on ASQA's website. So, as Emma outlined, the purpose of today's webinar is to take you through some of the improvements to our audit practice that we've recently made in line with the recommendations to come out of the rapid review. Feedback was sought from stakeholders during the rapid review relating to ASQA's regulatory approach. Now, your submissions highlighted a number of concerns that some of you have around our audit practice. For example, some expressed concerns related to ASQA's focus on administrivia and inputs, rather than on learner outcomes and competence. Some of the confidential case studies provided by stakeholders described circumstances where they had been found non-compliant based on missing information from a document or inconsistencies in documentation which were likely to have little or no impact on student outcomes. Another area of concern you expressed related to our audit reports, including the use of standardised wording, ambiguous descriptions of non-compliance, and limited detail relating to the evidence relied upon in support of our findings. Amongst other things, your feedback informed the rapid review recommendations, some of which target short, medium and longer term actions to be undertaken by ASQA, but also in collaboration with the sector. So as part of ASQA's reform agenda, we have made some improvements to our audit practice to better align with principles of best practice regulation. Some of these improvements include changes to how we deal with minor deficiencies, changes to our audit reports so that they're easier to understand and make clearer links between the evidence collected and any findings of non-compliance, and also creating better opportunities for providers to respond to issues and concerns during the audit process prior to ASQA making any findings of non-compliance. These changes were rolled out on the 17th of August 2020 as part of a broader program of work. We've made amendments to some of our resources which support our audit practice and have also delivered training across the various regulatory operation teams. It is really important for me to point out that you may not see and experience these changes immediately, but we have been transitioning to the new approach and will continue to build on these improvements over the course of the year. I'll now take you through some of the improvements to our audit practice in some further detail, starting with minor deficiencies. We acknowledge that not all issues identified throughout the course of any audit will be significant enough to give rise to a finding of non-compliance with a clause. So as part of the changes to our audit practice, we've developed some guidance around minor deficiencies and also developed a consistent approach on how we deal with them. Where auditors identify minor deficiencies or minor non-compliances, they will consider their significance, including the context and the extent of the non-compliance. And there are a number of factors that they will be taking into account, including the nature and extent of the non-compliance, the impact of the non-compliance on students, how systemic the non-compliance is, whether the non-compliance could have occurred despite systems and controls being in place, and whether the non-compliance can be readily fixed or addressed. Auditors will consider a deficiency to be minor if it has a negligible impact on students, does not impact the overall intent or outcome required of the clause, can be readily fixed, is not systemic, is administrative in nature, or could have occurred despite controls being in place. That is, it's likely to be inadvertent, an accident, or unintended. You can expect that auditors will discuss these minor deficiencies with providers as they arise during the audit or otherwise at the closing meeting. And we will seek providers' agreement to remedy the deficiencies identified. Minor deficiencies will be recorded under a new section of the audit report, where it will explain the issues that may have been identified during the audit, if any, which were sufficiently minor such that they didn't give rise to a finding of non-compliance against the relevant clause. And providers will not be required to submit a response or any evidence in relation to these minor deficiencies. We've also made some adjustments to our audit reports so that they're easier to read and understand. And importantly, that there are clearer links between the evidence and any findings of non-compliance. One of the purposes of an audit report is for ASQA to clearly communicate and describe to providers any non-compliance that has been identified through the audit process, so that providers can understand where they're falling short and where they need to improve their performance. This means that we've moved away from a reliance on standardised or templated wording to strengthen our analysis and description of the evidence so that we are recording robust findings in the audit report. So at a high level, the structure of the revised audit report will set out the clause against which a provider's assessment performance is being assessed, the key sources of relevant evidence that have been relied upon, a summary of the evidence analysis, audit findings, which will be a succinct description of reasons for finding of non-compliance by reference to the relevant part of the clause. Acknowledging that in most cases where there is non-compliance, it's usually in relation to an element of the clause and not the clause in its entirety. There will also be a heading setting out the action required. So where there is non-compliance identified, there will be a description of the action required to meet the relevant clause. And as I set out earlier, minor deficiencies, if there are any. So the revised format of the audit report lends itself to a more narrative style of writing. The changes we have made to the structure of the audit report and the adjustments to our audit practice will better support auditors to ensure that their findings are based on the totality of the evidence collected, and where non-compliance is recorded, to clearly describe the reason for the finding of non-compliance with reference back to the relevant evidence. We've also made some improvements to our audit practice relating to the way in which we engage and communicate with providers during an audit. This includes identifying when an audit begins and ends. So that is not conceptualising an audit as being either desk-based or site-based, but as all audits, including a number of common elements, irrespective of what has triggered the audit. For example, all audits will include an element of planning or scoping, engaging with providers or their representatives, collecting evidence, analysing evidence, the drafting of an audit report, and sending the audit report to the provider. We've previously identified the dates of the audit on an audit report as being the dates of a site visit. However, in line with our revised concept of an audit, to better align with audit principles, an audit begins from the point that the auditor starts planning or notifies a provider an audit is being conducted, whichever is first, and ends at the time the audit report is finalised and sent to the provider. These are the start and end dates that will be reflected on the revised audit report. We will also be requesting some additional information from providers earlier in the audit process. Requesting documentary evidence earlier has a number of benefits. We will be able to better scope the audit, identify any further information to be followed up, and highlight any issues that might need to be explored through interviews so that we are not assessing a provider's performance narrowly, meaning that we are not determining compliance based on the documentary evidence alone, but we are following lines of inquiry through interviews and observations to assess and test out a provider's practice. So what's happening in reality? We also want to ensure that providers have sufficient time to gather the information needed as part of the audit process, and that the audit is conducted in an efficient and effective manner with minimal impost on the provider's operations. We've also sought to create better opportunities for providers to respond to issues and concerns during the audit process. This includes how we approach our closing meetings as part of the audit process. The main purpose of a closing meeting will be to discuss any issues that we've identified throughout the course of the audit, so any apparent non-compliances, explaining that further analysis of the evidence will occur before our findings are made. Findings which will be explained in the audit report. Being fair and transparent means that auditors will be having discussions with providers to allow them to respond to any areas of concern relating to compliance with the standards prior to making any findings of non-compliance. We've also made some adjustments to some of our correspondence, including notifications of audit, requests for information, outcomes of audit, and notice of non-compliance letters, so that our language is more engaging and less clinical. Our revised letters will follow a format that clearly sets out what you can expect from us, as well as any action we require from providers. ASQA will promote and nurture a culture of voluntary compliance by providers with their regulatory obligations. And we will do this by taking a principles-based approach to regulation, which aims to minimise the need for enforcement, by encouraging organisations to understand the values behind the law and change their behaviour accordingly. Not because they might get caught out by the regulator, but because they understand why the law is there and what its objectives are. The emphasis on outcomes in principles-based regulation allows regulated entities to work towards the effective implementation of the principles within their own organisational context. ASQA's principles-based approach is focused on self-assurance and excellence in training outcomes. Self-assurance is about providers critically examining their own performance and student outcomes, identifying ways to improve their performance, and to ensure that they consider compliance with the standards as a core part of their business. At Audit, ASQA's focus is to test providers' systems and processes for ensuring sustained compliance, continuous improvement, and quality outcomes for students. This means that we do need to develop a new audit methodology for auditing against a new set of standard clauses to better support consistency in the interpretation of the standard clauses, and a focus that is fixed on quality and self-assurance. As part of our reform agenda, we are also revising our compliance management framework. This will include consulting with the sector around the undertaking to remedy process, which will provide, in certain circumstances, a longer period within which providers will be able to address the non-compliance identified through the audit process on a more systemic and sustained basis. ASQA's reform agenda includes an ongoing program of consultation with the sector as we implement the recommendations of the rapid review. There are different ways in which we will consult with stakeholders, including through the stakeholder liaison group, provider roundtable discussions, and webinars. In relation to the changes which we aim to roll out in April 2021, we will be consulting with you in relation to the revised audit methodology and undertakings to remedy. In addition, April 2021, we will see some structural changes within ASQA. Specifically, we will be separating out our audit function to quality assessment teams who will focus on assessing provider performance, and compliance teams, who, where non-compliance is assessed, will case manage providers' return to compliance, and where compliance can't be achieved, will make decisions relating to the appropriate regulatory response. So on that note, I might hand back to Emma, who will have a look at any questions that you might have arising from the content and our update and summary in relation to some of the changes we've made to our audit practice. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Carmen. And I must say, I mean, so Carmen and I obviously work together. We talk to each other almost every single day, and within ASQA, this has, been something that we've been living and breathing for quite some time now. But even me just hearing Carmen talking to you with a different perspective, so talking in the context of what does it mean for providers and how does this fit outside of ASQA. I found it incredibly interesting. So thank you very much for that. Now, this obviously we're only about halfway through, so we're not at the end of the webinar. Before we do get into questions, as a reminder, we are seeing a lot of value, and I hope you are too, in regularly running these types of webinars or in developing other forms of information and guidance on relevant and needed topics. So there will be a post-webinar survey which asks you to identify any suggestions. So please let us know if you do have any suggestions or comments. And for me personally, that's really quite important. So the reform happily has seen a significant focus to be placed on the value and importance of education and engagement. So I hope you can see we're doing more, really trying to provide more value in what we do to support the wider sector. So any feedback about upcoming topics for webinars, topics for other things other than webinars, or even other ways that we can reach as many RTOs as possible will be absolutely considered. Now, for this webinar, if you do want to submit a question for us to discuss now, remember to keep it broad and relevant to the topic, and we're already seeing quite a few come through. So please use the question pane in your control panel to do so. Now, as a reminder, onto the next slide, thanks, Shannon. But the most up-to-date information is on the ASQA website, which is asqa.gov.au. You can also contact our info line on 1300 701 801 or email inquiries at asqa.gov.au. The ASQA website on the homepage does include a direct link to our Working Together for Better Regulation reform activities. I've also mentioned some previous webinars, such as the self-assurance webinar, and you can find these under the education resources on our homepage. And we've also mentioned the vet reform roadmap and the ASQA reform, and more information about this can be found on the Department of Education, Skills and Employment website. So we'll head into the questions, and as I said, we've received quite a lot. The way we're going to work it is that I will ask the questions that are coming through. A lot of these will be obviously directly to Carmen, but then I will support with any particularly operational questions that are needed. So Carmen, the first question that has come through is, what steps has ASQA taken to homogenise the recognition of what is a minor deficiency? And I suspect that is for auditors.
Thanks very much for the question. So, look, you've definitely captured an important theme, which is that it is absolutely critical that we develop across the board what a shared understanding of a minor deficiency is. And so, as I kind of articulated during the presentation today, there are a number of characteristics or factors which will be taken into account, which will suggest that a deficiency is minor in nature. There are also some other factors that I outlined during today's session, which will also provide guidance and a framework for auditors to be able to work within to determine the significance or extent of a minor deficiency. So we do have the framework and factors to be taken into account as part of our key supporting resource to auditors in their audit practice. From a training perspective, we spent quite some time working through minor deficiencies, and of course, not just through the practical, not just through the theoretical analysis of determining whether or not a deficiency is minor or more substantive in nature, such that it does contribute to a finding of non-compliance against a clause. We ran through a number of practical applications, which also did include reviewing some existing findings and really testing out whether or not, based on the factors that we have identified and also the working framework, how effectively auditors are able to exercise their judgment in making that determination. And what I can say as being part of the training is that our auditors are able to clearly identify and distinguish the difference between a minor deficiency and a finding of non-compliance against a clause. I think our difficulty in the past has really been not necessarily having developed a consistent or well-articulated framework which informs the factors to be taken into account, and also to develop up the consistent way in which we can deal with a minor deficiency and include it in our audit reports.
Thank you for that one. I'm just going through a bunch of questions. What I'll do is I'll give you a general question, but just while you think of that answer, I will then also, there's a couple of tic-tacky ones that I can definitely respond to, but some of the more complex questions that have come through really come down to that April 2021 date for the second phase of the audit practice. And it is particularly about what the major differences will be that you can anticipate. Question about why it is so far into the future. So we're 24th of August now to 24th of September, sorry, into April. What is the time taken needed for it, and what that separation will mean as well. So just while you're thinking of that one, because they're quite complex questions, Carmen, I'll answer some very easy ones, which is apparently we're receiving quite a lot of questions about current audits that are happening right now and whether they'll be under the new audit or the old audit reports. And ultimately, in terms of the reports, it will come down to the time. So when did the activity happen? Obviously, if the activity happened and we're almost at the end of it, depending what has already been written and how it's been written, that will be the process going forward. But to the best endeavours, so a lot of these activities that are happening right now, to our best endeavours, will be implementing as much as we can as soon as we can. So we do acknowledge that over the next, we've now been a month into it, so we're really getting into it. So a lot of activities that are happening right now should be going in under the new model with new considerations, asking for more evidence ahead of time. But we're going down that pathway. So yes, there is a transition process that we do acknowledge, but we're hoping to be able to get into it quite quickly. So Carmen, I'll head over to you about the April 2021 implementation date.
Great, thanks Emma. There are a few elements in that question. So I guess I'll try and address them one by one. So I guess a general comment that I would make in terms of the time frame, so stage 1 rolling out in August 2020 and then stage 2 rolling out in April 2021. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that we recognised the importance of really strengthening our audit approach and ensuring that our audit practice is built on a solid foundation. Having regard to best practice regulation, and our good administrative law principles and our audit principles. There was really the opportunity and necessity for us to ensure that that foundation is solid before we continue to build on and make improvements to our audit practice. So that's why we identified the 3 key areas that I've kind of taken you through in terms of what those improvements will look like as part of phase 1 of our audit practice, which really goes to ensuring we are building that solid foundation. The second piece that I think also contributes to why that April 2021 date signifies rollout of phase 2 is that, as you are aware, there is a lot of work on foot and a lot of work that's already been undertaken by Michelle Dawkins and others in consultation with the sector around our approach to self-assurance. So moving away from, and this was addressed in the rapid review report, moving away from an inputs-driven approach to compliance and being focused on outcomes and self-assurance. So what this means in terms of, I guess, this shift in our approach to compliance is that we recognise that the current clauses against which we audit do not best align with our approach to self-assurance. So therefore, we have acknowledged that we do need to develop up a revised audit methodology. We also recognise that it's incredibly important that we consult and collaborate with the sector on the revised audit methodology. And so we really also wanted to give sufficient time, not only for us to develop up and propose a revised audit methodology, but to be able to consult with providers in the sector more broadly and other stakeholders in a very genuine way. And likewise with our compliance framework, which, as I mentioned, will also include a new feature called an undertaking to remedy. And I'll just explain a little bit in principle about what that undertaking to remedy might mean. Is that where non-compliance has been identified as part of the audit process, at the moment, the response that's available to providers is to essentially seek to remedy the non-compliances that have been identified within a 20-day period. An undertaking to remedy, where it's appropriate, could be entered into between ASQA and also a provider. This will enable a greater or a longer period of time within which providers have to address the non-compliance identified in a sustained way. So what we acknowledge through the undertaking to remedy process is that where, for example, non-compliance might be more systemic in nature, that 20-day time frame is not always a realistic one to achieve compliance in a sustained long-term way, which will also support return providers to compliance in such a way that they will be in a position to be able to self-identify any future risk of non-compliance, not just when the regulator is looking over their shoulder. Again, we see this as being a really great and necessary opportunity for us to engage with providers around what that undertaking to remedy process looks like, because its effectiveness will certainly hinge on essentially your contribution and buy-in. And so again, that's another key area that we want to ensure that we are really consulting with providers and stakeholders in a very genuine and meaningful way. The third part of the question, which relates to separating out our quality assessment and compliance functions, can be described as our quality assessment teams being focused on, through the audit process primarily, assessing a provider's performance against the standards. Their role will be defined partly by the audit process, right through to the production of an audit report in which any findings of non-compliance will be substantiated and supported by findings of fact and reference to the evidence. If the outcome of that audit report is that there are findings of non-compliance, then the workflow will go to our compliance teams. Our compliance teams will then work closely with providers through the compliance case management process with an aim and view to return providers to compliance as quickly as possible. In the event that a provider is unable to return to compliance, then any decision to impose an administrative sanction would come from the compliance teams, not from our quality assessors, which are our auditors. So that's the distinction, I guess, in terms of quality assessors being focused on assessing provider performance and compliance officers being focused on providing support to return providers to compliance as quickly as possible, and where that's not possible, to make a decision that is appropriate and proportionate depending on the circumstances of that particular case. Let me know if I missed anything there, Emma.
And I appreciate with everybody that it is, and part of the other advantage here of there is such a long time frame is it's obviously, from Carmen just talking, it's really quite complex and it's very big, and there's a lot of moving pieces in this. So you know, generally businesses have two choices. They can either work on these things behind the scenes, so you know absolutely nothing about it, and then you come out and say, here it is, it's shiny, brand new, we're going to follow this way. And then everybody else around you have to scramble to get on board with it as well. At least here, you know, we're acknowledging that we're bringing you along for the ride at the same time, which allows us to also make improvements and things as well. But that means that by the time we're actually ready to launch stage 2 here, everybody will have moved with us at the same time. So that's a really good thing. Some of the other questions, bringing it back to the current stage 1, relates to time taken regarding audit reports or to finalise the audit. So anticipating if the time taken to finalise the audit reports will change, and whether or not audits, particularly the site visit component, needs to be longer to enable auditors time to determine the information that they need. So some of the really good things that we're changing here is obviously requesting information before the actual site visit. So that means we're getting a lot more information up front so that we can look at it, so that we can collate the sorts of questions that we would like to ask you about, and help us bring it all together. So although there are a lot more pieces here now, there is a lot of information that we're requesting right at the very beginning, which will help. I will acknowledge that this is also a change for our auditors. So right now, everybody is learning a new process. And for that, yes, it is likely that right now, while they're learning to write in a different way, to collate the information that they need to collate differently, that will take longer. We have an advantage at the moment in that there are no fees being charged for these activities. So to that end, it gives us time to be able to practice, to get it right, to then get better, so that in the future we will be a lot faster. In terms of finalising the audit report to sending it out, and Carmen, you can definitely interrupt me here, because the actual site visit itself doesn't signal the end of the audit, and there is still the opportunity to be looking at more evidence, to collate that evidence, determine what it actually means, and write it up. The actual when does the audit end might occur after that site visit. So we're acknowledging that it might take longer than after the end of that site visit, but everybody is working through it to be able to put the information in the best way possible.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, there's probably a couple of things that I would add to your response there, which is to emphasise our commitment to meeting service standard timeframes. And we still remain committed to that, while acknowledging, as Emma said, that we are going through a learning phase, and like any adjustments to any practice, it can take some time to refine and develop up those skills. In relation to whether or not a site visit is anticipated to actually take longer for an auditor to be able to determine what information they might need, if I can just give you a bit of a snapshot as to what our previous audit practice kind of looked like in the event that there was a site visit component, was that while on site, while there was some evidentiary or documentary evidence rather that was requested prior to attending a site visit, a significant part of the site visit involved collecting and analysing documentary evidence. And also in most instances, actually required auditors to analyse that evidence and make findings at the end of that site visit. I think this resulted in a couple of things, including that our evidentiary focus was quite narrow. And I think the consequence of that was that we were at times, due to those time restraints, making assessments of providers' performance based quite narrowly on documentary evidence. As Emma said, one of the advantages for both ASQA and also providers to assist us in better understanding a provider's performance and their business is to request that documentary up front so we can identify any areas or issues of concerns that we might have, so that the site visit component isn't consumed by requesting, reading, analysing and making conclusions or findings, but rather is an opportunity for us to follow lines of inquiry, to better understand not just what the documents might say, but to understand your practice, your business, and what's happening in reality. So I guess from that point of view, I don't anticipate that site visit components will take any longer, but that in terms of us being able to understand and assess the totality of the evidence, acknowledging that we will also need to go away and consider the evidence that has been collected in some further detail before making our findings, will help support us and also you in ensuring to the best of all of our ability that the audit process can be conducted in the most efficient and effective way with a view to minimise its impost on your operations.
Thank you. So just going through, and I'm glad you interrupted because it gave me a chance to go through a few more questions. What I might do is try and bring some questions that relate to this current stage one now and the current things that are happening, and then we'll allow a few minutes at the end to go through what will happen further on into the future. Something that we are receiving as a lot of questions, Carmen, and I'll just put to you is some examples on what a minor deficiency is. But in terms of that as well, there has also been questions relating to some education and guidance about what minor deficiencies include. And I'll just comment on that one, that there is already some information on our website regarding the audit practice, which outlines what those minor deficiencies are. But I'll acknowledge that this is obviously very much an interest point, so I'll take that one on board. But Carmen, for you, in terms of examples about what a minor deficiency would include or could include.
Sure, I'll give a sort of pretty clear or pretty simple, straightforward example just to kind of illustrate the point. But then I will also give a little bit of an example how what might on the face of it appear to be a minor deficiency could in fact be an indicator of a more systemic type issue. So I think one very sort of straightforward example that I can refer to illustrate what we mean by a minor deficiency might be an incorrect course code in a training and assessment strategy versus the information that's on a provider's website. In a lot of circumstances, that will be a minor deficiency. It has a minimal impact on students. It can be readily fixed or addressed. It doesn't appear to be systematic in any way. The extent of that non-compliance is limited. And I think importantly there, it appears to be that it is likely to have been inadvertent or an accident. It essentially could be a typo. And we understand and acknowledge that we can't be perfect all the time and that we do make some mistakes. So I guess developing up that shared understanding on being able to identify, well, what is a minor deficiency and what is the consistent way across the board in which we can deal with a minor deficiency while on audit includes consideration of these factors. And it's important that we state them in a principled way as factors and considerations to be taken into account and not specific prescriptive examples. And the reason for that is if you use that same example that I've just described on what appears to be an inadvertent error, if the auditor was to ask a provider, if I look through all of these critical documents and if I look through the rest of the website, will I find similar errors throughout this material? And if the answer to that is yes, and further lines of inquiry demonstrate that it's not in fact an inadvertent error or a typo, but seems to suggest inconsistencies, errors, inaccuracies, and potentially misleading information for students across the board, you can see how that is a systemic issue, and we get a much broader sense of, firstly, the impact that that might have on students. That it's starting, and it certainly does appear to impact the intent or outcome of the particular clause being considered, couldn't be readily fixed. It is systemic in nature, and it is difficult to see how that could have occurred if there were controls and appropriate systems in place. So in terms of being able to assess the context and also the significance and the extent of the non-compliance, you can see in that second example that it is far more systemic in nature, is not readily fixed and couldn't be readily addressed, and becomes a much more serious non-compliance, if I can frame it in that way, that we, as the regulator, would be supported in making a finding of non-compliance and be working together with providers as part of that compliance case management process to return them to compliance, to address that issue in a sustained way, which isn't simply fixing up a typo on a web page or in a document.
And I think that's a really good example, because it's a situation where a genuine, something that can be seen as a genuine accident in one circumstance, you can then appreciate how it actually evolves, that it actually no longer becomes a genuine accident. And that's the RTOs having the controls in place to be able to monitor and continually review what it is that they're doing within their own business operations. You know, we appreciate that any organisation will make a genuine accident at some time, but it's the controls and the things that they do to ensure that they're providing a quality service so that it doesn't evolve from that genuine accident stage. So and I'm conscious that there are 4 minutes left. I'm going to ask one question which I hope is a very easy question, and then we might go into something a bit more complex which relates more to stage 2. There have been 2 questions which I'm going to relate together, and one is regarding whether or not the audit methodology framework will be published, and the second part to that is whether or not the self-assessment tool is going to be updated to reflect that audit methodology. So I'll let you answer, Carmen, but I believe the answer will be, because we are going to be engaging with the sector, the methodology is going to be available.
Yes, that's right. So I think what we will certainly be available, and necessarily so in line with the consultation that we would like to undertake with providers and other stakeholders, is to be able to identify the new clauses against which we will be assessing a provider's performance, which will look at touching on each of the standards. At this point in time, we're still developing up what that revised audit methodology might look like, to be able to essentially work together with the sector and kind of test out and understand your views in response to whether or not those clauses, and having regard to the intent and objective behind those standards, are sufficiently testing out, if you like, performance against our self-assurance approach. And with respect to the self-assessment tool, yes, as part of ASQA's reform, the self-assessment tool is also being reviewed in as part of our reform agenda.
Excellent. And this, and I appreciate this is going to be quite a vague answer, but I've received advice, we've received quite a lot of questions here, and it's regarding the updates to the standards for RTOs as a result of, as part of the wider vet reform, and as a consequence also updates to the standards for vet regulators, particularly with regards to qualification requirements of auditors. So I'll let Carmen also contribute here, but just to acknowledge that the standards themselves are managed obviously through the Department of Education, Employment Education Skills. So while ASQA itself is a regulator, we regulate to these documents. The actual work that ASQA is directly doing within ASQA does not relate to that work. Carmen, did you want to say anything in particular with that, noting that I've got a minute left for everybody?
There's probably not too much more to add, Emma, so I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge that yes, we recognise that we have received a lot of questions there, but that's a bit difficult for us to answer in that regard. So in that regard. And in conclusion, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I would also particularly like to thank Carmen and the team who are working behind the scenes to help deliver these webinars. If you do have any further questions, you can contact ASQA's info line, and the contact details are on this slide. And also regularly visit the ASQA website for the most up-to-date information. Now, a link to the recording of this session will be emailed to all attendees within the next few days, and it will also be published on our website. As a reminder about the post survey, so if you have a suggestion for future topics, please include it in your survey response after the webinar closes. Thank you once again, everybody. I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Emma.